President Donald Trump's choice to escalate the conflict with Iran should have drawn the familiar support of European allies. However, reality exposed a different paradox. Instead of standing shoulder to shoulder, many European nations appeared hesitant or even openly opposed. The chilly silence, critical statements, and refusal of military support revealed an increasingly distinct gap within the Transatlantic alliance. Observers suggest that this reaction is not a momentary phenomenon, but rather the result of a long-simmering process of structural fracturing. Europe no longer seems to perceive strategic priorities in the same way as the United States, nor is it willing to accept the repercussions of Washington's unilateral decisions. While the US views Iran as a hotspot that must be addressed, Europe is caught up in more direct consequences such as energy instability, immigration pressure, and the risk of internal division. From this perspective, the question is no longer simply why Europe does not support the US, but more deeply whether the two sides truly still stand on the same strategic front. As interests, priorities, and approaches to the international order grow increasingly divergent, this mismatch may not just be a reaction to a single conflict, but a sign of a profound reshaping phase in US-European relations. That increasingly evident mismatch does not actually originate solely from the conflict with Iran, but is the consequence of a prolonged process of erosion in transatlantic relations. Under Donald Trump, strategic trust between the US and Europe declined significantly. Unilateral decisions, ranging from trade to security, led many European nations to develop a growing skepticism toward Washington's role as a responsible leader. No longer viewing the US as the stable pillar of the international order, Europe began to see this partner as an unpredictable variable. More importantly, the two sides differ increasingly in their approach to the international system. While Europe emphasizes rules, institutions, and legitimacy, the US under Trump prioritized short-term national interests and was willing to act outside multilateral frameworks. It is this divergence of standards that makes Europe's hesitant response not an instantaneous reaction, but the accumulated result of long-standing strategic disagreements. Building on that fractured foundation, differences in strategic interests further deepen the gap. For Europe, the most direct and urgent threat remains Russia, especially in the context of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The US, shifting its resources and attention toward the Middle East, is perceived as a dangerous strategic distraction. Furthermore, the economic consequences of the conflict impact the two sides asymmetrically. Escalating energy prices, disrupted supply chains, and sharp increases in import costs all weigh heavily on European economies that are dependent on external energy. Meanwhile, the US, with its position as an energy powerhouse, suffers fewer negative impacts and may even benefit in some cases. From this viewpoint, many analysts argue that the US is exporting risk, while Europe is forced to import the consequences. This asymmetry leaves European countries with no strategic incentive to support a conflict for which they must bear the majority of the costs. More deeply, many analyses suggest that Europe's reaction also reflects a structural concern: the erosion of the rules-based international order. For decades, Europe has been a major beneficiary of the system protected by the United Nations and multilateral institutions. Therefore, US military action without broad authorization is seen as a dangerous precedent. It not only undermines the legitimacy of the international system, but could also be cited by other powers to justify their own actions. Linking this to the conflict in Ukraine, Europe is even more sensitive to arguments regarding intervention and sovereignty. Alongside geostrategic and institutional factors, internal pressure also plays a significant role in how Europe shapes its stance. The wave of immigration from the Middle East over the past many years has made this issue one of the most sensitive political challenges. Every fluctuation in this region has the potential to trigger chain reactions, from new flows of refugees and pressure on welfare systems to the rise of extremist trends and social division. European governments are thus forced to weigh not only foreign policy interests, but also domestic stability. A new conflict in the Middle East, if escalated, could exacerbate the fractures already existing within European society. The combination of these factors shows that Europe's reaction to US policy is not a sudden turning away, but a manifestation of a profound strategic adjustment. As trust declines, interests diverge, the international order is threatened, and internal pressures mount, Europe's distancing from Washington becomes an inevitable choice rather than an exception. These differences in interests and strategic perceptions not only cause Europe to keep its distance from Washington, but also highlight a deeper issue. Europe itself is not a unified bloc. The reaction to Donald Trump's policies quickly exposed long-standing internal fault lines within the European Union. On the surface, the contrast between Spain and the United Kingdom is a clear testament. Madrid expressed a fairly decisive opposing stance, not only due to internal political factors, but also because of historical memory and a deeply rooted anti-war sentiment in society. Conversely, London, despite initial hesitations, still chose to stand close to Washington, reflecting a special relationship shaped over many decades. However, the deeper line of division lies between Eastern and Western Europe. Eastern European nations, particularly those that were once under direct Russian influence, tend to view the US as an irreplaceable security guarantee. For them, maintaining close ties with Washington is more important than any disagreement over specific policies. Meanwhile, Western European countries with more stable economic and political standing tend to push for strategic autonomy, desiring to reduce dependence on the US and build a more independent role on the international stage. These two approaches create an internal tug-of-war, making it difficult for the EU to present a unified stance on major issues. Therefore, the assertion that Europe reacts as a unified entity is actually only relative. In reality, the EU is a collection of overlapping interests where each nation still prioritizes its own calculations. This not only weakens the capacity for collective action, but also leaves Europe in a state of wanting to distance itself from the US while being unable to truly detach from it. In that context, a controversial but increasingly mentioned observation is, does Europe truly want the US to fail in the conflict with Iran? This phrasing, if understood superficially, easily leads to the misconception that Europe is leaning toward Iran. However, analysts argue that the nature of the issue is entirely different. What Europe fears is not whether the US wins or loses on the battlefield, but the political consequences of a victory. A Washington victory could consolidate Trump's unilateral approach, creating a precedent for similar actions in the future. Conversely, a failure, or at least an unclear outcome, could act as a deterrent, forcing the US administration to adjust its strategy and return to multilateral mechanisms. Furthermore, US domestic politics is also an important variable. Europe, while not intervening directly, closely monitors the movement of the balance of power in Washington. A prolonged conflict, or one that fails to achieve clear results, could affect Trump's political standing, thereby opening the possibility for a rebalancing within the US political system. For Europe, a United States with tighter checks and balances on power and less inclined toward unilateral action would be a more predictable and cooperative partner. Equally important, Europe is particularly sensitive to precedents in international relations. If unilateral US military action is deemed successful and meets no significant opposition, it could further erode the principles of sovereignty and international law. In a world where these norms are applied selectively, middle-tier powers like European countries would be the ones to suffer more damage. Therefore, not wanting the US to win in that manner is also a way of protecting themselves from long-term consequences. All of these factors place Europe in a particularly difficult position. On one hand, they remain deeply dependent on the US for security, especially through mechanisms like NATO. On the other hand, they increasingly disagree with how the US uses its power and shapes the international order. Dependence and disagreement coexist to create a state of being simultaneously attached and detached, a strategic paradox that has yet to find a clear resolution.